Hi, I'm Aubrey Adams. I'm here with Bob Troyer, U.S. Attorney, Colorado. Former U.S. Attorney, Colorado. And we were just talking about how the legalization of marijuana invited organized crime into our state.
Right.
And you were talking about the environmental impacts. And you mentioned about the human trafficking. What can you talk about with that?
Both in big outdoor grows, usually with Mexican cartels. We have found most of, when I was U.S. Attorney, we found most of the people who were doing the work on those grow sites were illegals who were brought here to farm those sites. We've had other cases, the other large cases that we had involving organized crime involved Cuban organized crime and Asian criminal organizations. Both of those organizations as well had many of the folks working the grow sites, even if they were indoor grows in houses, were brought here against their will or brought here under false promises and pretenses and had their immigration documents or other things that gave the owners of the facility leverage over the workers, withheld from those workers, so the workers would work long hours under very difficult illegal conditions to produce the product for their organizations. So there are lots of other ancillary crimes that follow a very, very lucrative illegal drug trafficking organization, whatever the drug is. You see car thefts, you see electricity and water theft, you see fire and other hazards, degradation of property values, degradation of neighborhoods from the gutting of houses. You see all those kinds of things.
Home explosions?
A lot of home explosions from butane hash oil labs. A lot of identity theft also associated with those groups so that they can commit other crimes but also have identity documents for their workers. And so there's a proliferation of ancillary criminal conduct that comes when you have legalization. And it's important to note that all of that stuff is outside of the legalized system. Those folks are not paying taxes on the product, and they're not getting licensed, they're not following any of Colorado's rules. But when I was U.S. Attorney, we did cases, we'd actually talk to the defendants, the people in these organizations who, if they chose to cooperate for a reduced sentence, would tell you about the business. And they would say, make no mistake, we're here because it's legal in Colorado. Not that we're complying with the law, but because no one's paying attention, because everyone thinks it's legal.
Correct.
So we can operate in this house, we can operate out there in an open public grow site, and the neighbors in the community and sometimes even the law enforcement thinks we must be legal because they're so used to seeing grow equipment, grow lights, fertilizer, seeds. They're used to the smell.
The smell, yes.
It's so normalized
The smell is
that
awful.
you can turn a state into a theater of operation.
Yeah.
It doesn't require an international border crossing to get your dope to Florida.
No. And that supports the statement from Dr. David Murray from the Hudson Institute. He made a statement saying the legal and the illegal markets support and enhance each other. You really can't separate the two. It's very difficult to separate the two.
Right.
And would you agree with that statement then? Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm not commenting one way or another on legitimate, law-abiding entrepreneurs who come here and follow every rule the state imposes on them to have a grow or to have an extraction lab or to sell at a retail level. But those folks as well can't ignore the fact that their existence does make it easier for the black marketeers to exist.
Okay, that's good clarity there.
And there is also little question in my mind or in the mind of the U.S. attorneys in states like Oregon, Washington, and California that when you see the overproduction figures from growers in all of those states, especially Oregon, I think last year Oregon had just as recorded by their regulatory agency out there that tracks how much is grown and how much is sold, about 1 million pounds more marijuana grown than was sold at a retail level.
Yeah.
So that's going somewhere.
Yeah, so knowingly, these states that have legalized, they know that they're trafficking these products to other states, which is against federal law. So, that's one of the issues I've always been like, how can a state knowingly know that this is happening and not be held accountable for it? Do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, I mean, the answer to that is it would be the U.S. attorney in that district, like I was, or others at the Department of Justice who would have to hold the state accountable. And there's just been no political appetite for that. And there's also an opioid crisis. I mean, when I was a U.S. attorney, and you have a lot of other crimes that you have with your limited resources that you have an obligation to enforce, and one of those is actually killing people. And the number of folks who are dying in your state is going up and up, and every year, the only reasonable thing to do is put your drug enforcement resources more toward opioids than marijuana, which allowed a longer period of development of this industry. And frankly, I'm not saying anyone intended it.
Yeah.
But the opioid crisis and law enforcement's attention to the opioid crisis benefited the industry, the marijuana industry.
Yeah. There's just only so much resources and manpower to go around to combat all these terrible issues that we're facing. So I get that. Also, you mentioned about crime going up, murders going up with marijuana. Would you say marijuana is connected with killing murders?
I've never seen as good an analysis of that as Mr. Berenson has in his book. There's clearly an association and a correlation there. I don't think the scientific research has established yet. I don't know how it really could, but I don't think it's established beyond a reasonable doubt that the murder rate will go up X percent based on Y degree of marijuana usage.
But have you personally seen cases where murder involved marijuana?
Look, I mean, the industry has attacked law enforcement for saying murder rates and crime rates, aggravated assault rates have gone up in Colorado since legalization. And said, okay, those two things happened at the same time, prove that marijuana caused it. That's almost impossible to do for a lot of different reasons, and it's unfair to ask law enforcement trying to solve those crimes and many, many other crimes to keep the community safe, to completely change the way they keep statistics and they test blood in certain kinds of circumstances in order to have data to respond to the industry on this. But the reality is, just for example, in 2017, in Arapahoe County, one of our suburban counties, there were 11 marijuana homicides directly related to marijuana. I mean, it was an illegal black market sale of marijuana. Someone tried to rip somebody else. We call them marijuana rips.
Oh, yeah.
Either the buyer tried to rip the marijuana without paying for it, or the seller tried to take the buyer's money without giving up the marijuana, and someone ended up dead. So just in one county in 1 year, 11 directly related. There are also increasingly signs, and law enforcement is increasingly aware of how many crimes against children and other acts of violence are committed by heavy marijuana users or users of high potency marijuana. And frankly, even law enforcement has this um, bias that we've all been conditioned, those of us who grew up in the 60s and 70s and even the 80s, to believe marijuana is harmless. So even law enforcement tends not to look to marijuana as a potential cause, so they don't investigate it. So they won't record, for example, if there's a terrible homicide where a mom kills 3 kids. They're just going to prove the homicide and convict her of the homicide. They're not going to look and then keep the data and try to document that she was a heavy user who dabbed regularly 90%
Right.
THC products.
Right.
So those stories are out there, but those are anecdotes.
Right. And I'm hoping that with Alex Berenson's book, that law enforcement and all the first responders realize that much of the mental illness they're seeing, there is a connection with marijuana and how that's played. I personally feel terrible that we have put our law enforcement in this position where they are more at risk with
Yeah.
this violence and unpredictable behavior that we're seeing, and how they're navigating that and how they're handling that. So I just want to say, as a citizen, I'm sorry that it's become more dangerous to do those jobs.
Well, it has become more dangerous, and it's interesting. In the last 5 or 6 years, there's become greater public awareness that it's unfair to law enforcement to ask them also to be mental health
Yes.
providers. And what I think we're starting to see with Alex's book, and I think the next wave will be people understanding how much that mental health increase and the unfairness of asking law enforcement to be mental health providers is also linked to marijuana usage.
Yeah.
So I think that's the next link that's just starting to develop. People have understood there's a problem that can't be solved by the police in increasing mental health issues, and I hope they'll start to understand there's an increase in mental health issues because there's an increase in marijuana use.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for taking all this time. I just have a couple more questions
Okay.
for you. Going back to the human trafficking, Sheriff Elder of El Paso County had said, there's indentured servants. We have modern day kind of slavery, indentured servants here tending the marijuana grows. These people are made to be there, and then you called it a rip, where they go in, and even people from the same organization will steal marijuana and then keep those people in those unsafe positions again. And
Right.
that's what you were talking about, modern day indentured servants here in
Right.
Colorado.
Right, and that's common on the public land grows, and we did, when I was U.S. Attorney, a number of cases with Sheriff Elder. And you see it in big networks of home grows or outdoor grows, like in eastern El Paso County. You see it in the public land grows in the national forests, where they'll bring folks in over whom they have leverage because they're illegal, right? And they'll say, we're going to pay you $100 a day as soon as the crop is harvested. And they'll harvest the crop and take it and say, you got to do one more crop before we pay you, right? And then they get busted by the cops and they never get paid, or someone does a rip and they never get paid, or they never get paid, or they get partially paid, so that the bosses can keep them working and keep them under control, keep them in that indentured servitude cycle.
That's just terrible. That's what's awful.
So
It's
there's a
happening.
lot of there's a lot of bad stuff done to the environment, done to property value, done to neighborhoods, done to just the livability of places like the Colorado Springs area when black market groups go in. There's the human trafficking stuff, and it all exists because you can, like I said before, even with 150 plants, you can make several $1 million a year
Yeah.
in an environment where the way the black market traffickers describe it is there's 5 links in the chain in that business model. You have to have a place to grow, you have to plant, you have to cultivate, you have to harvest, and then you have to ship it to market. If you're in Colorado, The only one of those links that gets any attention is the shipping it to market. So why not be here?
Yeah, really. Well, and so you've dealt with some major organized crime, and for a parent like me, I educate people when they legalize marijuana to be grown in homes. There's probably a lot of people that follow those rules, but there's many that don't. So if they want to make really big money, they ship it out of state and make big money. But if a mom and pop just wants to sell to the neighborhood, they're in our neighborhoods too, and it's so
Right.
easy for our kids to get those products too.
Right.
So when you talk to other states or other elected officials or even federal officials, do you recommend the legalization of marijuana to them?
No.
Okay.
No.
I'm not surprised.
I mean, I've spoken in a lot of other states, and I've talked to voters and legislators in other states just to share the Colorado experience, because they don't get an accurate picture from the lobbyists in the industry that has dollar signs in their eyes, and they get the politicians excited about the revenue it's going to earn for their state. And they have talking points that have been effective in the past that are getting less and less effective as people like you with your work talk about the harm it does to families and kids, as people like Alex talk about the mental health and violence harms. The more that word gets out, the more superficial and clearly deceitful the industry messaging is. So I've talked to a lot of people in other states about the Colorado experience. Agnostic, apolitical. Before you do this, think about the magnet for the black market. Think about what it does to your kids. Think about what normalizing something that we know increases a child's chance for psychosis or other mental health issues. Before we tell them it's okay to put it in their body, before we call it medicine, let's take a breath here. I think even though the industry says legalization nationally is inevitable, look at all the states that have legalized. The ones that have retail are really only 9 states that have retail marijuana. And a lot of them recently, over the last several years, the industry has lost. Okay, states have rejected the kind of system Colorado has. So I actually have great faith that as education continues and people like your group do their work to tell people and require the elected officials to base their public policy decisions and their votes on facts and science about the health and safety impact of starting a third addiction industry in this country. Just take a breath and consider those things before you go down that path. I think actually this is not as inevitable as the industry thinks it is.